Welcome to another episode of Russian Hate Speech, where we break down the Kremlin's latest lies against the West. At the end of October, beginning of November 2025, Russian propaganda channels openly spread predictions about Europe's inability to secure peace, claims of the West's loss of sovereignty, explicit nuclear threats, and calls to shift the war into Europe. On October 31, 2025, on the program The Most Shocking Hypothesis on REN-TV, its host Igor Prokopenko claimed that Western politicians and countries were allegedly on the brink of catastrophe and incapable of guaranteeing peace. Prime Minister Starmer, Chancellors Merz, Presidents Macron and others, Carlos, von der Leyen, these are all political leaders of roughly a military mold, and they can live only in conditions of a proxy war. But on the other hand, they apparently don't quite understand that if they manage to ignite real war, their political life will be measured literally in minutes, and hardly anything of the European countries themselves will remain within a few minutes. The goal of this kind of information provocation is to frighten the audience, portray the West as uncontrollable and dangerous, and justify Russian aggression as defensive or inevitable. Such rhetoric serves to dehumanize the opponent and prepare public opinion for escalation. On the same October 31, 2025 episode, political scientist Vladimir Shapovalov spread the thesis of alleged desovereignization of the West, framing it as a systemic policy. Western countries pursue a policy of desovereignization, a policy of destroying national sovereignties, a policy of domination that doesn't provide for equal dialogue, but presupposes subordination to the Western center, Western hegemony. Unlike our partners and allies in the East and the South, in the countries of the global majority, with which Russia develops equal relations, on the BRICS, SCO, OPEC+, and other economic and political platforms. He sets up an artificial contrast between Russia's equal ties and the West's aggressive policy to create an image of Moscow's moral superiority and to justify its expansion under the banner of fighting hegemony. In effect, this discredits international cooperation and replaces real policy with the myth of external enslavement. On October 2, 2025, on the program News of the Week, the editor-in-chief of the journal National Defense, Igor Korotchenko, voiced an outright nuclear threat against the United Kingdom, presenting it as a demonstrative show of force and a means of political blackmail. As for the United Kingdom, let me stress again, Britain is an island state. Therefore, about 5 Poseidons would be enough for Britain to also disappear from the geographical map of the world. Such a statement is an explicit propagandistic threat aimed at intimidating the population and foreign partners. The rhetoric has one goal: to normalize ideas about using mass destruction as an adequate response, prepare society for escalation, and justify aggression. On November 5, 2025, on 60 Minutes Special Edition, Andrei Isayev, deputy head of the United Russia faction, propagated the narrative of a so-called Russian victory in the hybrid war, which is meant to demoralize Western audiences and strengthen the illusion of Moscow's strategic success. When the West began the war against Russia, a hybrid war, one of its aims was certainly to strengthen its unity. A common enemy we must rely. We must unite against this common enemy under the banners of the ruling liberal globalist elite. We see that they achieved quite the opposite result. The split in the West has deepened rapidly. The liberal globalist elite is losing power and influence. One could say that in this sense they have already lost. Isayev uses typical phrases intended to reassure his own audience. The goal of propaganda channels is to sow doubt about the resilience of international support for Ukraine and to weaken the resolve of its partners. Also, on November 5, 2025, on Evening with Vladimir Solovyov, political commentator Vladimir Kornilov proposed a coldly cynical narrative about moving the war into Europe, calling it a justified step.
Polish sociologists note that for the first time in their studies, the number of people who feel negatively toward Ukrainians has exceeded those who feel positively. Here you have the relationship. This is Poland. I won't even say about Germany. They should die there, in Ukraine, to keep the war away from Europe. I believe we should really consider making the war. Not our war, come there to Europe, to distract them. And accordingly, if they so cynically say that the war must be kept away from Europe, we can also raise the question of how to make the war be there, in Europe, away from us.
With such justification for escalation and shifting responsibility, propaganda appeals to feelings of self-preservation while legitimizing the sacrifice of other people's lives as an acceptable price. This is how Russia continues to inflame hatred and justify international violence. On November 6, 2025, again on 60 Minutes special edition, Igor Korotchenko once more played out a scenario of nuclear escalation, dramatizing the timing and consequences of a strike to create an effect of inevitable catastrophe.
We may soon face the deployment in Europe, on NATO territory, of a new class of American medium-range missiles, with flight times of about 6-7 minutes to targets on Russian territory. This means that after a launch is made, we would need an immediate response involving our nuclear triad, and of course understanding that it would be extremely advantageous for the Americans that a potential nuclear conflict in the format of a limited nuclear war would take place only on the European continent, but the corresponding strike, then where? A target on the continental territory of the USA, and given that there is practically no time to figure it out, what is 6-7 minutes? This would automatically mean the launch of the first wave of strikes against the territory of the USA by the whole class of Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles. Well, in the first strike I would expect yes, this is approximately delivery to targets on US territory. In the corresponding, I emphasize, strike, not even in a counter but in a corresponding strike, approximately 300 nuclear warheads. For the USA, this will be catastrophic consequences. They may simply, as a result of their fatal military strategic mistakes, provoking such a variant of Russia's response, simply disappear from the political map of the world.
This rhetoric is a direct escalation provocation aimed at creating an atmosphere of nuclear fear and justifying preemptive or retaliatory strikes. Such propaganda messages not only amplify fear and tension but also legitimize the aggressive behavior of the aggressor state, using informational pressure as a tool to influence both the international community and the domestic audience. Thank you for joining us today. Stay tuned for the next episode of Russian Hate Speech, where we will continue to expose the Kremlin's war on reality.